Donald Trump returned to office with a flurry of executive orders and appears to be stronger than ever. Well into his second year in office now, and his approval ratings have plummeted. According to one poll, just 35% of respondents approve of his performance in the White House, and 70% disapproved of his management of the cost of living. In recent weeks, his administration has been forced to abandon a controversial $1.8 billion compensation fund intended for people who claimed they'd been targeted by what Trump called the weaponization of government. Republican lawmakers rebelled over the idea that the money would go to people jailed for the January 6th Capitol riot. Republicans are also split over support for Ukraine and have challenged the president's authority to launch military action against Iran without congressional approval. So are these simply policy disagreements, the normal rough and tumble of politics, or are there signs that Donald Trump's grip on his party is weakening? And how much has his support been damaged by starting this illegal war with Iran after being elected on a promise of keeping America out of foreign conflicts? Well, let's put those questions to Kim Lane Scheppele. She's a professor of sociology and international affairs at Princeton University in the United States. Also, an expert on the rise and fall of constitutional governments. Welcome to DW, Professor. Do you see Donald Trump's grip on the Republican Party slipping?
It may be slipping, but only temporarily and not enough to really challenge him. So what we're seeing is that his policies are very unpopular. His public support is dropping. But he also has a grip on his party so that every time he decides that one of the members of Congress is not pleasing him, he comes out and criticizes that person, and then they lose the next election. So this terrifies them all. And they're all staying in line, so there might be a small bit of criticism, but so far it hasn't really dented his support in the Congress.
And so why do you say temporarily?
Well, we hope that his party will eventually break with him, but, we kept thinking his party was going to break with him by now because, as you said, he started a war when he promised not to. He's massively corrupt. There's this small matter of the so-called slush fund, which was supposed to pay off the January 6th protesters, as he calls them. He's done many, many things that his party criticizes, that his party doesn't like, and yet they never really break with him in a fundamental fashion in order to really limit his power.
I mean, on the slush fund, as you call it, this $1.8 billion that was to be set aside, that seems to have gone by the wayside now that his Republican colleagues have effectively vetoed it. What do you think caused those Republicans finally to locate their backbones?
Well, the settlement, so-called, that has this $1.8 billion slush fund, as we call it, actually had two parts. So it had this big, huge amount of money that was supposed to go to people who had been prosecuted under the Biden administration. But it also has a second part, and the second part immunizes Trump, his family, and his businesses from any investigation by tax authorities forever. Now, that part is still on the table. That part has not been taken back. The only part that his party really objected to was this $1.8 billion fund, and that has gone by the wayside, but not actually necessarily permanently. So his attorney general has refused to put in writing, in his own words, that the slush fund will never come back. And it looks like they're trying to figure out some other legal authority to use to pay off these people that supported Trump.
Okay, so you see this as a minor temporary setback amongst the flurry of presidential edicts. This is just a blip.
Yes, they haven't given up on it altogether.
Right.
They'll come back in some other form.
And what of the voters? How is he doing with voters? He's near record loss of popularity. What's causing that?
Yeah, well, his record loss of popularity is being caused by the fact that prices are going up. So the price of oil and therefore the price of gasoline, and remember, Americans love their cars, that has been going up. Food prices have been going up. All kinds of prices are going up, and his supporters don't like that because they elected him on the promise that he'd bring prices down. So that's by far the biggest issue.
Once again, it's the economy, stupid.
It's the economy, yes.
All right. So here's the thing about this president. Does even the notion of a Congress of Republican lawmakers that don't fully support him and falling popularity amongst voters, does any of that bother a headstrong president who doesn't have to stand for another term?
Well, he seems to get more outrageous rather than less outrageous the more that people stand up to him. And because he has these threats against lawmakers that he can, as we put it, primary them. So they have to stand for election within the Republican Party to get to be the candidate. Then there's a second election, which is where the general public gets to vote. In that first stage, this is where he really is beholden to, or his members of his own party are beholden to a very firm electorate that still supports Trump. So he threatens them with this process of getting them thrown out of the party, essentially, before they get to run for office. And that has really cowed them into going along. So he becomes more and more outrageous. There are occasional pushbacks, temporary setbacks for the president, and then he comes back stronger, doing the same thing all over again.
Let's talk about MAGA. Part of your research has focused on the rise of populist movements. Give us your assessment of MAGA, this informal but powerful movement. And people think it stands for one thing, one set of narratives, but then as Marjorie Taylor Greene and Tucker Carlson have found, if those narratives change, they can change to whatever Donald Trump says they are.
Yeah, so about a third of the population is really firmly behind Trump. That's not enough to win elections, but it's enough, like I said, to get to these primary competitions. It's also enough to sort of generate a competition and to generate misinformation about the Democratic Party against the possible opposition. So even though MAGA is not a working electoral majority, it's a big enough minority that it can actually have a big effect in American politics, especially when the Democratic Party is in some disarray, especially when there's no firm opposition within the Republican Party to stand up to Trump. So any very big, firm bloc is going to win, even if it's a minority bloc.
Populist movements often appear united when they're trying to get into power. Historically, what tends to happen once they govern and confront the difficult trade-offs between ideology, national security, and economic reality?
Yeah, well, these kinds of autocratic takeovers that are spurred by these extremist movements can stay in power a long time if they wind up if they capture the media, if they capture the institutions, if they capture the judiciary. After a while, they actually don't need that much public support to stay in office, especially if they start to capture the electoral system. And we see this now happening in the United States. Oh, yes. I think even for this year, we're seeing an extraordinary acceleration of very worrisome developments with regard to these so-called midterm elections.
For instance?
For instance, well, the latest thing is that the U.S. Supreme Court has now essentially nullified, the so-called Voting Rights Act, which was the big act that brought minority populations in the U.S., particularly African-American voters, fully into the democratic system. And what this Voting Rights Act used to require was that there be so-called majority-minority districts, so electoral districts in which, again, particularly African-Americans, also Latino Americans, had a chance of electing representatives that represented them. The Supreme Court just declared several weeks ago that all those districts are now unconstitutional. So there's about 20 electoral districts across the country which are going to be revised now in the wake of this decision. And those are districts that not only tend to elect Black and minority candidates, but they elect Democrats, because overwhelmingly these populations vote Democratic.
You talk about that as a bad thing, as it being a state capture, but you're talking about a system that has a constitution that is revered by everyone, that has a Supreme Court whose justices are elected or nominated, certainly, by presidents of various stripes. So he's working the system as it's established.
Yes, and it's a system that's been rigged. So when Donald Trump was president the first time, he got 3 seats on the 9-member Supreme Court.
Does that count as rigging, or does that count as a fortunate quirk of fate that 3 justices left while he was president?
Well, 2 of those 3 seats were captured in a very unconventional manner. So first there was a seat on the Supreme Court that came open under the under the term of his predecessor, Barack Obama, the Republicans in the Congress prevented Barack Obama's nomination from going through because they said it's too close to an election when it's within a year of the election. Okay, so then at the end of Donald Trump's term, there was Justice Ginsburg died just as the election was going on already. And then the Republicans speeded up the nomination of a Republican nominee. So two of the three were, shall we say, nominated under questionable circumstances.
Okay. Let's turn to what's happening here in Europe. We have Viktor Orban in Hungary, often portrayed as one of the most successful and durable populist leaders in the democratic world. Yet Hungarian voters have just voted him out. Why did that happen?
Yes, so this happened, actually, it's so interesting because, first of all, Viktor Orban is now a model for Donald Trump and actually advising the American Republicans. So this is not just two completely isolated cases. But what happened in Hungary was that Viktor Orban had really rigged the election system, and he rigged the election system so that a vote in the countryside counted 2 to 3 times as much as a vote in the cities. And Viktor Orban thought that made him immune from the vagaries of electoral change. Now, what Peter Magyar did, the challenger, was to spend 2 years going village to village to village, saying, look, Viktor Orban is stealing all the money from the state, and that's why your hospitals don't work, and that's why your schools don't work. And he flipped all these districts that had voted for Viktor Orban for 3 decades.
So again, he worked the system that was there.
He worked the system, but he worked a rigged system, again.
Right.
Like, he had to win the rural voters. But he did. He actually did, and he won within Orban's system. And he even won from, Orban had this system tilted in such a way that if you got a certain majority, you got bonus seats in the parliament. And Peter Magyar understood how the system worked, played into it, and flipped it.
So is there a lesson from Hungary that America should learn as we look to the future?
Yes, absolutely. And so one thing to say is that the way that Peter Magyar won was to build a very big tent and to unify everybody except that hardcore in favor of Orban. You could get a very big majority of voters who are upset with everything Victor Trump, that Donald Trump has done. I work on both systems, right? Everything Donald Trump has done, because he only has 1/3 support, really. So you take the 2/3, you have to find some program, and it could be the same program. Look at all the corruption. Look at everything Donald Trump is stealing from the national treasury. And therefore, everything that makes life livable for people in the United States is going downhill. We're defunding everything where you need public funds, from education to healthcare to everything else. One reason why the prices are going up is because of the corruption in the Trump administration. So you make the exact same argument that could win an election.
Okay, so it's as with all politics, I suppose, you have to have a strong narrative, a strong story to tell.
Right. And a strong story that's neither left nor right.
Right. Thank you so much for guiding us through that, Professor Kim Lane Scheppele from Princeton University.
Thank you so much.